Imagine you're standing in a schoolyard watching more than 60 children, all separated into different groups, pointing at exactly the same empty patch of sky. None of them are looking at each other for guidance. None of them are conferring or checking their stories. They're simply pointing, independently, at the same coordinates in space, describing the same object, the same figure, the same movement, with a precision that shouldn't be possible unless what they saw was real. This isn't a story about belief or skepticism. This is a story about patterns, about what happens when human testimony aligns so perfectly that it challenges everything we think we know about memory, suggestion, and the reliability of mass witness events. What you're about to discover isn't just another retelling of the Ariel School sighting. It's an investigation into why this case remains one of the most compelling examples of collective observation in modern history, and what it reveals about the nature of extraordinary experiences when they happen to groups rather than individuals. The hook here is simple but powerful. We know from psychological research that group memories contaminate easily. Children especially are susceptible to suggestion, to feeding off each other's excitement, to creating collective narratives that blur truth with imagination. Yet the Ariel School children did the opposite. Their accounts remained stable across days, their emotional responses stayed consistent, their physical gestures matched without coordination, and their fear never wavered into performance. When you understand why this is so unusual, you begin to see why researchers, psychiatrists, and even hardened skeptics found this case impossible to dismiss. What happened at Ariel School on that morning in 1994 wasn't just a UFO sighting, it was a demonstration of human perception operating under conditions that science struggles to explain. Before we dive into what makes the Ariel School case extraordinary, we need to understand why mass witness events are usually considered unreliable. In most cases involving large groups claiming to see something unusual, researchers find a predictable pattern of deterioration. The first accounts tend to be vague and contradictory. As people talk to each other, their stories begin to merge. Details that only one person mentioned initially start appearing in everyone's narrative. Emotional responses escalate as the group feeds off collective energy. Within hours or days, what began as scattered observations becomes a unified but unreliable story, shaped more by social dynamics than actual experience. This contamination effect is well documented in psychology. Studies on eyewitness testimony show that when multiple people witness the same event, their memories become less accurate the more they discuss it together. Leading questions from authority figures can shape entire narratives. Social pressure encourages conformity. Children, in particular, are known to adopt the dominant story in their peer group, especially when adults reinforce certain details. This is why skeptics often dismiss mass sightings involving children outright. The assumption is that one imaginative child sparked an idea, other children latched onto it, teachers inadvertently reinforced it, and within hours you have a collective fiction that everyone believes is real. But the Ariel School case breaks every rule of this pattern. When the children were first interviewed, they were separated across the playground in different groups. They hadn't had time to coordinate their stories. Yet when asked independently what they saw, they pointed to the same location, described the same object, and used the same gestures to demonstrate movement. More remarkably, their descriptions contained specific, unusual details that repeated across dozens of interviews. Large black eyes, a gliding motion rather than walking, a silent presence, and a sensation of receiving a message without words. These weren't generic UFO tropes that children might have picked up from movies or television. They were precise, consistent, and deeply unsettling details that remained stable even when children were interviewed days apart by different people. What makes this even more significant is the absence of adult involvement in shaping the narrative. The teachers at Ariel School did not witness the event. They were inside the buildings during the morning break when the sighting occurred. When they came outside and found the children in a state of panic, they had no framework for understanding what had happened. They didn't offer explanations. They didn't suggest interpretations. They simply listened as the children, one after another, described something that left them genuinely frightened. This lack of adult guidance created an environment where the children's accounts remained pure and unfiltered. There was no authority figure telling them what they saw or validating certain details over others. The consistency emerged organically, not through suggestion. Another crucial factor is the emotional uniformity observed across the group. When children fabricate stories together, their emotional responses tend to vary widely. Some get excited, some get theatrical, some remain detached. But at Ariel School, nearly every child displayed the same type of fear. It wasn't exaggerated or performative, it was quiet, controlled, and visceral. Some children were trembling. Others refused to go near the edge of the playground for hours afterward. Many struggled to articulate what they felt, not because they were inventing it, but because the experience defied easy categorization. This emotional coherence is one of the strongest indicators that something genuine occurred, something that affected them all in the same profound way. One of the most compelling aspects of the Ariel School case lies in the precision of independent testimony. When researchers examine mass witness events, they look for convergence points, details that multiple people describe without having the opportunity to coordinate. The more specific and unusual these convergence points are, the stronger the case for genuine observation. At Ariel School, the convergence was extraordinary. Children interviewed separately at different times in different locations on the playground all described the same sequence of events with remarkable accuracy. They saw a bright metallic object descend from the sky. They saw it hover or land near a patch of scrubland beyond the fence. They saw one or two figures standing near the object, and they saw these figures move in a way that defied normal human locomotion. The detail that stands out most is the gliding motion. When asked how the figure moved, child after child demonstrated the same gesture. They would move their hand horizontally in a smooth, continuous line, emphasizing that the figure didn't walk or step, it glided as if its feet weren't touching the ground. This wasn't a vague description, it was a specific, repeatable physical demonstration that appeared across dozens of interviews without variation. Children who had no contact with each other during the sighting, who were standing in different parts of the playground, who came from different grade levels and backgrounds, all independently showed the same motion. This level of consistency is nearly impossible to achieve through suggestion or group contamination. It suggests that what they saw was concrete enough to leave a clear, unified impression on their memories. Another remarkable convergence point involves the physical features of the figures. The children repeatedly described large black eyes, thin bodies, and dark clothing. These descriptions appeared immediately before any group discussion could occur, and they remained stable across multiple interviews conducted over several days. When children were asked to draw what they saw, the drawings matched. When they were asked to point to where the figures stood, they pointed to the same spot. When they described the size and shape of the object, their hands formed similar outlines in the air. This kind of precision is not typical of fabricated group stories. It's the hallmark of genuine shared observation, where multiple independent witnesses saw the same thing and retained the same visual details in their memory. What's equally important is what the children didn't do. They didn't elaborate wildly. They didn't add fantastical elements. They didn't compete to tell the most dramatic version of the story. Instead, they struggled to find words for what they experienced. Many hesitated when describing the internal sensation they felt, the sense that the figure communicated something about the earth or the environment without speaking aloud. This struggle to articulate an unfamiliar sensation is another indicator of authenticity. Children inventing stories tend to add clear, dramatic details to make their accounts more exciting, but these children did the opposite. They described confusion, discomfort, and an inability to fully explain what they felt. That kind of honest difficulty is far more convincing than confident, elaborate narratives. The precision extended beyond visual details to environmental context. The children described the time of day accurately. They remembered the position of the sun, which helped establish the direction they were facing. They identified specific landmarks on the playground, allowing investigators to reconstruct their vantage points with precision. When asked about sounds, they consistently said there were none. The object didn't make noise. The figure didn't speak. Even the usual sounds of the playground seemed muted during the encounter. This acoustic detail, the silence, appeared repeatedly across interviews and added another layer of consistency to their accounts. The fact that they all remembered the same absence of sound is as significant as the presence of visual details. Fear is often dismissed as a subjective emotion, unreliable as evidence. But in the context of mass witness events, fear can be one of the most telling indicators of authenticity. Human beings, especially children, don't sustain genuine fear responses for extended periods unless something truly frightening occurred. When children pretend to be scared or exaggerate fear for attention, the performance is typically obvious. They smile, they giggle, they break character. Real fear, the kind that lingers for hours or days, has unmistakable physical and behavioral markers. At Ariel School, the fear displayed by the children was not performative. It was deep, involuntary, and consistent across the entire group. When the first journalists arrived at the school on the day of the incident, they found children who were still visibly shaken. Some were crying, others were holding on to each other for comfort. Many refused to go near the edge of the playground where the sighting occurred. Their body language spoke volumes. They weren't excited or eager to tell their stories. They were withdrawn, tense, and reluctant to relive the experience. This type of response is consistent with genuine trauma, not with children playing a game or seeking attention. The teachers confirmed that the fear was unlike anything they had seen before. It wasn't the temporary fright that comes from a schoolyard prank or a scary story. It was a sustained emotional reaction that lasted well beyond the initial incident. One of the most compelling testimonies came from a teacher who described a young child clinging to her arm for nearly 10 minutes, refusing to let go. The child's grip was tight, desperate. She kept looking over her shoulder toward the scrubland as if expecting something to reappear. This wasn't a child acting scared for effect. This was a child experiencing real, visceral fear. When fear manifests in physical symptoms like trembling hands, rapid breathing, and clinginess, it's no longer just an emotional state. It becomes physiological evidence that something deeply unsettling occurred. The fact that this fear appeared across dozens of children simultaneously without coordination strengthens the case that they all witnessed the same frightening event. Another aspect of the fear response that deserves attention is its persistence. Days after the incident, when Harvard psychiatrist Dr. John Mack arrived to interview the children, their fear had not diminished significantly. They still showed discomfort when asked to describe what they saw. Their voices wavered, their hands fidgeted. Some children looked down or away when recalling the encounter, as if the memory itself was difficult to confront. This sustained emotional reaction is not typical of children who have invented or exaggerated a story. Fabricated narratives tend to lose emotional intensity over time as the novelty wears off, but genuine traumatic memories retain their emotional charge. The children at Ariel School were still processing what they had experienced, and their continued discomfort validated the authenticity of their accounts. The fear also manifested in specific, unusual ways. Several children described feeling frozen when the figure looked at them, unable to move or speak. This sensation of paralysis is often reported in encounters with the unknown, and it's not something children typically invent when making up stories. It's too specific, too strange, and too uncomfortable to be a product of imagination. The fact that multiple children described the same sensation without prompting suggests they all experienced it. This detail adds another layer of consistency to their accounts and reinforces the idea that something real and frightening happened at Ariel School that morning. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the Ariel School encounter is the message. Many of the children described feeling as though the figure communicated something to them, not through words, but through a kind of direct impression on their minds. They struggled to articulate what this message contained, but a common theme emerged across multiple interviews. The message seemed to be about the Earth, about environmental harm, about humanity's impact on the planet. Some children said they felt a sense of warning. Others described it as sadness or concern. The specifics varied slightly, but the underlying theme remained consistent. The figure, whatever it was, conveyed something about the fragility of the natural world. What makes this detail so significant is how difficult the children found it to describe. They didn't claim to have received a clear, articulated message. They didn't say the figures spoke aloud or transmitted precise instructions. Instead, they described a vague, unsettling sensation, a feeling that entered their minds without their consent. This ambiguity is actually a point in favor of their credibility. If the children were inventing the message, they would likely have made it clearer, more dramatic, more easily communicable. But instead, they struggled. They paused. They searched for words. They admitted they didn't fully understand what they felt. This honest confusion is far more convincing than a polished, coherent narrative would have been. The consistency of the theme, however, is remarkable. Despite the difficulty in articulating the message, nearly all the children who mentioned it spoke about the environment, about harm to the earth, about consequences. This convergence is significant because environmental themes were not prominently discussed in Zimbabwe in 1994, especially not among young children in a rural school. The idea that they would independently invent a shared narrative about ecological concern strains credibility. It's far more plausible that they all received the same impression from the same source, and that impression left them with a lingering sense of unease about humanity's relationship with the planet. Dr. John Mack, who interviewed many of the children, paid particular attention to this aspect of their testimony. He noted that the children didn't present the message as a prophecy or a command. They presented it as a feeling, a sense of something communicated on an emotional or intuitive level rather than through language. This distinction is important because it aligns with what we know about nonverbal communication and intuitive perception. Human beings are capable of receiving information through channels other than spoken words, and the children's descriptions of the message fit this pattern. They felt something, they didn't hear something, and that feeling stayed with them long after the encounter ended. The fact that the message involved environmental themes also raises interesting questions about the nature of the encounter. If the children had simply seen a strange object and a strange figure, the story would be unusual but not unprecedented. But the addition of a communicated message, especially one with a specific thematic focus, elevates the encounter into something more complex. It suggests intentionality on the part of the figure. It implies that the encounter wasn't random or accidental, but purposeful. Whether the message was real or a projection of the children's own anxieties, it adds a layer of meaning to the event that goes beyond simple observation. And the consistency with which the children reported this feeling, despite their difficulty in describing it, strengthens the case that something genuinely unusual was communicated during the encounter. The Ariel School case stands as one of the most compelling examples of a mass witness event because it defies nearly every pattern that typically discredits such incidents. It wasn't contaminated by adult suggestion. It wasn't shaped by media influence. It didn't grow more elaborate over time. Instead, it remained stable, consistent, and emotionally coherent across dozens of independent testimonies. The children's fear was genuine. Their descriptions were precise, their gestures matched without coordination, and their struggle to articulate the message they felt demonstrated an honesty that fabricated stories rarely achieve. All of these factors combine to create a case that resists easy dismissal. What can we learn from this? First, we learn that group testimony can be reliable under the right conditions. When witnesses are separated during the initial observation, when they are interviewed independently before they have a chance to coordinate stories, and when their emotional responses align with genuine fear rather than performance, their accounts deserve serious consideration. The Ariel School children met all of these criteria. They were scattered across the playground when the sighting occurred. They were interviewed separately before they could confer, and their fear was unmistakable and sustained. These conditions created an environment where collective memory remained accurate rather than deteriorating into collective fiction. Second, we learn that children can be reliable witnesses when their testimony is properly documented. The stereotype that children are easily influenced and prone to exaggeration doesn't hold up when we examine cases like Ariel School. Yes, children can be suggestible under certain circumstances, but when they experience something genuinely frightening, when their accounts are recorded immediately, and when their descriptions remain consistent across multiple interviews, their testimony can be as credible as that of adults. In some ways, it can be even more credible because children are less likely to impose cultural frameworks or expectations onto their observations. They describe what they see without trying to rationalize or explain it away. Third, we learned that physical gestures can be as important as verbal descriptions. The gliding motion demonstrated by the Ariel School children is a perfect example. Words can be ambiguous, they can be misunderstood or misinterpreted, but physical gestures are concrete. When dozens of children independently perform the same motion to describe how a figure moved, that gesture becomes powerful evidence of a shared observation. It transcends language barriers and eliminates the possibility of miscommunication. The uniformity of the gliding gesture across the Ariel School testimonies is one of the strongest pieces of evidence that the children saw the same thing. Fourth, we learned that the absence of sensory details can be as significant as their presence. The children's consistent mention of silence during the encounter is a crucial detail. Most people, when inventing a story about a UFO or strange figure, would add dramatic sounds. They would describe engine noises, footsteps, or voices. But the Ariel School children did the opposite. They emphasized the absence of sound. This detail is unusual, specific, and consistent across testimonies. It suggests that they were describing a real sensory experience rather than filling in gaps with imagination. Silence is harder to fabricate collectively than noise. Fifth, we learned that the inability to articulate certain aspects of an experience can actually strengthen credibility. The children's struggle to describe the message they felt is a case in point. If they were making it up, they would have made it clearer, but they didn't. They hesitated, they searched for words, they admitted confusion. This honest difficulty is a hallmark of genuine experience. It shows that they were trying to convey something that didn't fit neatly into language, something that existed at the edge of their understanding. This struggle is far more convincing than polished, rehearsed narratives. Finally, we learned that professional documentation matters. The fact that the Ariel School children's testimonies were recorded by an experienced journalist on the day of the incident and then later by a Harvard psychiatrist created a permanent record that could be analyzed for consistency and authenticity. Without this documentation, the case would have been far easier to dismiss. But because their accounts were preserved on film, because their gestures were captured, and because their emotional states were recorded in real time, we have a detailed archive that allows for rigorous analysis. This documentation elevates the case from anecdote to evidence, and it provides a model for how future mass witness events should be handled.
Every extraordinary claim deserves skeptical scrutiny, and the Ariel School case is no exception. Over the years, various explanations have been proposed to account for what the children reported seeing. Some skeptics have suggested mass hallucination. Others have proposed that the children saw a weather balloon or experimental aircraft and misidentified it. Still others have argued that the entire event was a product of suggestion, with one imaginative child sparking a collective fiction that spread through the group. Each of these explanations sounds plausible on the surface, but when examined closely, they fail to account for the specific details and patterns present in the case. The mass hallucination theory is perhaps the weakest. Hallucinations are individual experiences. They don't occur spontaneously across large groups of people who are seeing the exact same thing at the exact same time. While shared delusions can occur in small groups under specific conditions, usually involving religious fervor or extreme psychological stress, they don't produce the kind of precise, detailed consistency seen at Ariel School. The children weren't in a heightened emotional state before the sighting. They were on a normal morning break, playing and talking. There was no collective expectation or anticipation that might have primed them for a shared hallucination. Moreover, hallucinations don't leave physical traces. The children pointed to a specific location where they said the object landed. They described the terrain accurately. They identified the exact spot where the figure stood. This level of environmental correlation is not compatible with hallucination. The misidentification theory is more credible but still falls short. Some skeptics have suggested that the children saw a weather balloon or an experimental aircraft and, in their excitement, misinterpreted it as something more exotic. But this explanation doesn't account for the figure the children described seeing. Weather balloons don't have humanoid beings standing next to them. Aircraft don't land in the schoolyards and produce figures that glide without walking. The children's descriptions were too specific and too consistent to be explained by a simple case of mistaken identity. They didn't just see an object in the sky, they saw an object that landed or hovered close to the ground, and they saw figures that moved in a way that defied normal human locomotion. These details go beyond what a misidentified balloon or aircraft could explain.
The suggestion theory is the most persistent skeptical explanation, but it also crumbles under scrutiny. According to this theory, one or two children claimed to see something unusual, and through the power of suggestion, other children quickly adopted the story and embellished it. But this theory fails to account for the immediate consistency of the testimonies. The children were separated across the playground when the sighting occurred. They didn't have time to coordinate their stories before being interviewed. Yet when questioned independently, they described the same object, the same figures, and the same movements. Suggestion works through communication, through leading questions, through repeated exposure to a narrative. None of these factors were present at Ariel School in the crucial first hours after the event. The consistency emerged too quickly and too uniformly to be explained by suggestion alone. Another problem with the suggestion theory is the emotional response. Children who are feeding off each other's excitement or adopting a collective fiction tend to display theatrical, exaggerated emotions. They smile, they laugh, they compete to tell the most dramatic version of the story. But the Ariel School children displayed the opposite behavior. Their fear was quiet, controlled, and deeply personal. Many of them were reluctant to talk about what they saw. Some cried, others clung to teachers for comfort. This type of sustained, genuine fear is not consistent with a story that was invented or exaggerated through suggestion. It's consistent with children who experienced something that truly frightened them. Some skeptics have also pointed to the lack of physical evidence as a reason to dismiss the case. They argue that if something truly landed near the school, there should be clear physical traces, burn marks, disturbed soil, broken vegetation. But this argument assumes that any extraordinary event must leave obvious physical evidence, which isn't necessarily true. The children described an object that hovered just above the ground, not one that made direct contact with the soil. They described figures that glided rather than walked, leaving no footprints. The absence of dramatic physical evidence doesn't invalidate their testimony. It simply means that the event didn't involve the kind of forceful physical interaction that would leave obvious traces. What the skeptical explanations consistently fail to address is the totality of the evidence. They focus on individual elements, weather balloons, suggestion, lack of physical traces, and try to explain those elements in isolation. But the Ariel School case isn't just about one detail. It's about the convergence of multiple independent lines of evidence, the immediate consistency of testimonies, the precision of physical gestures, the sustained emotional response, the absence of adult influence, the struggle to articulate the message. When all of these factors are considered together, the skeptical explanations become inadequate. They can't account for the full pattern of observations and behaviors documented at Ariel School, and that's why the case remains compelling decades later.
One of the most valuable lessons from the Ariel School case is the critical importance of immediate professional documentation. If the children's testimonies had not been recorded on film by a BBC cameraman on the day of the incident, if their emotional states had not been captured in real time, if their gestures and descriptions had not been preserved for future analysis, the case would have been far easier to dismiss. Memory fades, details blur, stories evolve. But when testimonies are documented immediately before contamination can occur, they retain their evidentiary value.
The Ariel School case demonstrates how essential it is to treat extraordinary claims seriously from the very beginning, to approach them with the tools of journalism and science rather than dismissing them out of hand. The BBC cameraman, Tom Leach, understood this instinctively. When he arrived at the school, he didn't approach the situation with a predetermined narrative. He didn't try to guide the children toward a particular explanation. He simply documented what he saw and what the children reported. He filmed their gestures, he recorded their voices, he captured their fear. This neutral, observational approach is exactly what's needed when investigating mass witness events. The moment an investigator brings bias or expectation into the process, the integrity of the testimonies is compromised. But when documentation is done properly, with minimal interference and maximum attention to detail, it creates a permanent record that can withstand scrutiny for decades. Dr. John Mack's involvement several days later added another crucial layer of documentation. As a Harvard psychiatrist with extensive experience interviewing people who claimed extraordinary experiences, Mack brought a level of clinical rigor to the investigation that elevated it beyond simple journalism. He didn't accept the children's accounts uncritically, but he also didn't dismiss them out of hand. He asked careful, neutral questions. He allowed the children to describe their experiences in their own words. He paid attention to emotional responses, to hesitations, to the ways the children struggled to articulate what they felt. His documentation provided a second independent verification of the testimonies, and it showed that the children's accounts remained stable even when questioned by a trained professional days after the event. The combination of immediate journalistic documentation and follow-up psychiatric evaluation created a multi-layered record that is almost unique in the history of UFO cases. Most sightings are documented poorly, if at all. Witnesses are interviewed weeks or months later, after their memories have had time to shift and evolve. Leading questions are asked, cultural expectations influence how stories are told. But at Ariel School, the documentation happened quickly, professionally, and with minimal interference. This created a baseline of evidence that allows researchers decades later to analyze the case with confidence. We can watch the children's gestures, we can hear their voices, we can see their fear. We can evaluate their consistency. This level of documentation is what every extraordinary claim deserves, and it's what makes the Ariel School case so valuable as a case study. Another aspect of proper documentation involves avoiding the temptation to impose explanations. Tom Leach didn't tell the children what they saw. He didn't suggest that it was a weather balloon, an aircraft, or anything else. He simply asked them to describe what they observed and recorded their answers. This restraint is crucial because it prevents contamination. The moment an authority figure suggests an explanation, even a skeptical one, it begins to shape how witnesses remember and describe their experiences. But by maintaining neutrality, Leach allowed the children's accounts to remain pure. This is a lesson that applies not just to UFO investigations, but to any situation where accurate testimony is essential. Neutral documentation preserves truth. Suggestive questioning distorts it. The Ariel School documentation also demonstrates the value of capturing nonverbal information. Words can be ambiguous, they can be misunderstood or misinterpreted, but gestures, facial expressions, and body language communicate information that transcends language. When the children demonstrated the gliding motion with their hands, when their faces showed genuine fear, when their bodies tensed as they recalled the encounter, they were providing evidence that couldn't be faked or exaggerated. This nonverbal communication is some of the most powerful evidence in the case, and it only exists because the documentation was thorough enough to capture it. Future investigations of extraordinary claims should follow this model, using video whenever possible to preserve not just what witnesses say, but how they say it. The Ariel School case stands as a testament to the power of collective human observation when documented properly and analyzed rigorously. It teaches us that mass witness events can be reliable under the right conditions. It demonstrates that children can be credible witnesses when their testimony is preserved immediately and independently. It shows us that physical gestures can be as important as verbal descriptions. It reveals that the inability to articulate certain aspects of an experience can actually strengthen credibility. And it underscores the critical importance of neutral, professional documentation in preserving truth. Whether you believe the children saw an extraterrestrial craft and beings, or whether you think there's a more mundane explanation that is yet to be discovered, the patterns in this case demand serious attention. 62 children pointed to the same spot. They described the same object. They demonstrated the same movements. They displayed the same fear. They struggled with the same message. These are not the patterns of fabrication or suggestion. These are the patterns of genuine shared experience. And that experience, whatever its ultimate explanation, tells us something important about the nature of human perception, memory, and testimony. The Ariel School children didn't ask to see something extraordinary. They were simply playing during their morning break when something disrupted their ordinary day. What they witnessed left them frightened, confused, and struggling to make sense of an experience that defied their understanding. But despite their fear and confusion, they told their stories with remarkable consistency. They described what they saw without embellishment. They admitted when they didn't understand something. They demonstrated with their hands what they couldn't fully express with words, and in doing so, they created one of the most compelling mass witness cases in modern history. The legacy of the Ariel School case isn't just about UFOs or extraterrestrial contact. It's about the reliability of human testimony when documented properly. It's about the patterns that emerge when genuine shared experiences are preserved without contamination. It's about the importance of taking extraordinary claims seriously enough to investigate them rigorously. And it's about respecting the voices of children, who can sometimes see things more clearly than adults precisely because they haven't yet learned to rationalize away what doesn't fit their expectations. As we close this exploration of what 62 children can teach us about seeing the impossible, remember this simple truth. The strength of the Ariel School case doesn't lie in any single detail. It lies in the convergence of multiple independent lines of evidence, all pointing in the same direction. The precision of their gestures, the consistency of their fear, the stability of their accounts across time, the absence of adult contamination, the struggle to articulate the message. When you add all of these factors together, you're left with a case that resists easy dismissal. You're left with testimony that demands to be taken seriously. And you're left with the unavoidable conclusion that something extraordinary happened at that small school in Zimbabwe on a quiet morning in 1994. Something that more than 60 children witnessed together. Something they're still trying to understand decades later. Thank you for listening. If this analysis has given you a new perspective on the Ariel School case, please share it with others who might find it valuable. And remember, the strength of the Ariel School case doesn't lie in any single detail. It lies in the convergence of multiple independent lines of evidence, all pointing in the same direction. The precision of their gestures, the consistency of their fear, the stability of their accounts across time, the absence of adult contamination, the struggle to articulate the message. When you add all of these factors together, you're left with a case that resists easy dismissal. You're left with testimony that demands to be taken seriously. And you're left with the unavoidable conclusion that something extraordinary happened at that small school in Zimbabwe on a quiet morning in 1994. Something that more than 60 children witnessed together. Something they're still trying to understand decades later.